students, welcome back again. I am Samapti Sinha Mahapatra, your zoology teacher teaching in Sri Chaitanya Institute. We were discussing the chapter neural control and coordination, and we have already covered one major portion that was regarding the neurons. Today we are going to start with the central nervous system, as we already said in the previous lecture. And in the central nervous system, you know very well that there are two things. One is your brain and other is your spinal cord. Now, talking about the very first part of the CNS, yes, I am talking about brain. Now, students, this is the development of the brain. So, first of all, we will see how the brain is getting developed during the embryonic stage. So, during the embryonic stage, you will see certain things which you have to remember the names, okay? The part of the brain that is going to form the forebrain is called as prosencephalon. The one which is forming the midbrain is called as mesencephalon, and the one which forms the hindbrain is called as rhombencephalon. Now, talking about the prosencephalon, it has further been divided into telencephalon and diencephalon. When you see telencephalon, that means you understand that it's a part of forebrain. Telencephalon has got cerebrum, corpus striatum, hippocampus and amygdala, which we are going to discuss one by one when we will be starting with the very first part. Talking about the diencephalon, it has got thalamus, epithalamus and hypothalamus. Talking about the mesencephalon, it is not further divided, it is directly going to form the midbrain. Whereas talking about rhombencephalon, it is further divided as myelencephalon and metencephalon. When you talk about myelencephalon, it forms the medulla of the hindbrain. Then you talk about metencephalon, that is going to form the pons and cerebellum. Now, very important to remember the division very first, because if you remember the division, it would be quite easy for all of you to understand the different parts separately. But students, when we are talking about brain, do you know what the brain has got a shape of? Brain is present at the shape of walnut, okay, that's mentioned in your NCERT. So you have to remember the shape of the brain is walnut shape, and obviously it is a very soft tissue, so it is being protected inside the bony protection, and that bony protection, you know, is your cranium that acts as a brain box. We have already studied about all the cranial bones, and all the cranial bone together forms the brain box where your brain is protected. Now, talking about the meninges of the brain, there are certain layers that is called as the cranial meninges, which is also giving you the protection, which is giving the protection actually. And these cranial meninges, let us see what these three cranial meninges are, looking from outside to inside. Now, dura mater, arachnoid and pia mater, these are the three cranial meninges. Talking about the outermost is the dura mater, which is also called as the hard mother. Now, it is called as the hard mother because it is very tough, very hard. Now, it is a double membranous structure which is made up of fibrous connective tissue, which is why it is called as dura mater. Now, imagine if there is a layer which is the outermost layer called as the dura mater, and obviously below that there is a layer which is called as arachnoid. There is a space in between these two. The space between these two, or you can say the space below the dura mater. For below we use the term sub. So, the space which is present below the dura mater is called as subdural space. Okay, we will see the property of this subdural space, because you will see there is a difference in the subdural space, and there is one more space we will be discussing as we come to the arachnoid. This arachnoid is the middle layer, student, and this arachnoid is also made up of thin connective tissue. Just like a space below the dura mater subdural space, a space below arachnoid is called as subarachnoid space. What is the difference between these two is the presence of a fluid in your brain called as the CSF, or the cerebrospinal fluid. You will see that CSF is only present in the subarachnoid space, but it is not present in the subdural space. So, you can mark it over here that subarachnoid space has the cerebrospinal fluid. Now talking about the innermost layer is called as the pia mater, and this pia mater is very richly supplied with blood vessels, which is why we say that this is highly vascular. This is since the innermost layer, and since it is very soft, very thin, very delicate, this is called as the soft mother. This is the cranial meninges, which is the one which is closest to the brain. So these are some of the cranial meninges. Now what we are going to do is we are going to start with the different parts of the brain, okay? So obviously we are going to start with the forebrain. First we are going to discuss about the telencephalon and discuss the properties of all these parts. Now let us start with the very first part of the brain, that's your forebrain, okay? And forebrain is the most prominent part of the brain among forebrain, hindbrain and midbrain, alright? Talking about the very first part of the forebrain beta, that is cerebrum, okay? Cerebrum is the major portion of the brain, as well as you can say major portion of the forebrain as well. I have written it over here that cerebrum forms the major portion of the brain. Now talking about the cerebrum, I have written that we have got two cerebral hemisphere. So we have got one cerebral hemisphere this side and one cerebral hemisphere this side. We have right cerebral hemisphere and we have left cerebral hemisphere. And these two cerebral hemispheres are actually not separated, but they are connected with the help of group of or collection of axons. And we know that collection of axons, we gave a term that is called as tract. So these tracts, which is the collection of axon that connects both the cerebral hemisphere, is forming the corpus callosum. This corpus callosum is connecting both the cerebral hemisphere. Now talking about the cerebrum, if you consider one cerebral hemisphere, then each cerebral hemisphere you have certain lobes. This is one cerebral hemisphere. I am looking from this side, okay, and I have this side. I am standing like this, so I am looking at this side, and I have divided these lobes as the frontal lobe. So I have made this brain. You have this frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe, okay. Do you have frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe? So if I say in your one hemisphere you have got 4 lobes, then in total how many lobes you will have? 8 lobes. One in one cerebral hemisphere and other in other cerebral hemisphere. So total you are having 8 lobes. Now talking about the function of each lobe separately beta. Talking about very first your frontal lobe, I have written the functioning. The frontal lobe is associated with creativity, it is related with imagination, it is related with aptitude, logical reasoning, creativity, again I am repeating creativity, memory, thinking ability, voluntary motor activities, all are controlled by this first frontal part of your cerebrum, frontal lobe of your cerebrum. Also beta, talking about the frontal lobe, there is a very important area which is related with the frontal lobe, which is also associated with the speech. That area is called as Broca's area. That area is called as Broca's area, and Broca's area is going to control the speech. If in any way your Broca's area of the cerebrum frontal lobe is damaged, then the speech is lost, okay, because this Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe controlling the speech. Now talking about the parietal lobe, it is going to have control all the kind of sensations, the feeling of hot, feeling of cold, any kind of pain or sensations are recorded in the parietal lobe. Also reading a map, reading a clock is related with the parietal lobe. In fact, students, you know, even your dressing sense, that's the function of your parietal lobe. Now talking about the 2 lobes, one is this occipital lobe and the other is your temporal lobe, okay. Now first talk about the temporal lobe. What I have written is that auditory interpretation taking place here. What do you mean by auditory? Or the sound interpretation means all the sound impulses that you are able to understand, that is being converted in the temporal lobe. Signals are coming in your temporal lobe, that is auditory interpretation. While you talk about your occipital lobe, there is an area in the occipital lobe which is called as visual cortex area. This visual cortex area is going to control the visual information in the occipital lobe. Just like I have written one area called as the Broca's area, which is going to control the speech in the frontal lobe. In your temporal lobe, in your left temporal lobe, sometimes you say in your temporal lobe and parietal lobe, okay. Sometimes we say that the area I am talking about, which is Wernicke's area, located in between parietal and temporal lobe, and in some books you will find only temporal lobe, that Wernicke's area beta is associated with comprehension. Speaking ability with the Broca's area of frontal lobe, but comprehension is associated with the Wernicke's area. So that's the different lobes, okay. Lobes are not mentioned in that detail in your NCERT, but you can study this lobes for some higher examination. Talking about the cerebrum further, your cerebrum beta has outer part which is called as cortex, and it has inner part called as the medulla. So talking about the cerebral cortex majorly, that is very convoluted, okay. Now you see that cerebrum, I have made the wall, it is very much folded. Do you see this kind of structure somewhere else also? In the digestion also, the villi was appearing like this, okay. And what was the function of the villi? To increase the surface area for absorption. The function of all these convolutions in the cerebrum is to accommodate more and more neurons, okay. Because of this convolution, you will accommodate a lot number of neurons here. Also, sometimes we say that the more number of convolutions, more folds leads to more neurons, that leads to more intelligence, okay. But we can't control the convolutions. What we can do is work hard, and if we work hard, we don't need many neurons, you know. We have sufficient neurons. If you work hard, that is also going to pay off. So don't worry about the number of convolutions or the number of neurons that you have in your brain. But talking about this, do you see some bulges here? The bulges are called as the gyri. Gyri are the bulges that you see, and the grooves that you see is called as sulci. But there is something more which is called as fissures. Actually, sulci are the small grooves. Sulci are the small grooves, whereas when you talk about fissures, these are the deep grooves. Okay, if you see the deeper grooves, that is the fissure. If you see smaller grooves, that is your sulci. Now, students, a very important point regarding brain, because you can compare the brain with the spinal cord, and that's about the grey matter and white matter. Talking about the brain, you know that outside the brain you have got grey matter, and inside the brain you have got white matter. But what is the reason behind the location of grey matter on outside and the location of white matter on inside? And why do you say grey and white? Beta, you have got neurons, right? And when you talk about neurons, you have got cell body with some granules, Nissel's granules. The presence of the cell body, which I am drawing it here, you will see in this layer, outer layer. And due to the presence of the cell body in the outer layer appears greyish in color. But when you see from these cell bodies runs million of myelinated axons, and these myelinated axons, because of the myelination, you will see that this is appearing white in color. Hence, the brain has grey matter on outside but white matter on inside. In fact, some of the axons only connects both the cerebral hemisphere, and that's how it forms something called as corpus callosum. So that's something about the cerebrum. Let's discuss what else do you see in cerebrum. Now, just now we said that the brain is going to appear grey from outside and white from inside. That's what I have written, that grey matter outside and white matter inside. Now, talking about the different lobes is fine, but we can say that cerebrum is concerned with three different areas. One is your sensory areas, second is your motor areas, and third is your association areas. Talking about each of these areas, when you will see sensory areas, what the sensory area is going to do, it is going to interpret, it is going to understand, it is going to interpret the information received from your sensory receptors. Got it? The sensory receptors send the information to your cerebrum, so the sensory areas are going to interpret that information. Whereas when you talk about the motor areas, what motor areas are going to do is to control your voluntary motor activities. But when you talk about the association areas, beta, these association areas are neither completely sensory nor completely motor, okay? but they are associated with some functions like memory, like some functions like communication, and the activities, the coordinated activities of your sensory and motor, okay, just like the intersensory functions, I would say. It is related with intersensory function. Just like if I am looking at a food, I can smell it at the same time, I can eat it at the same time. It is never like if I am looking at a food, I will only look, I cannot eat. I can do both the activities at the same time with the help of the intersensory areas of the association areas, which is also related with functions like memory and communication. Now talking about the next part of your forebrain, we are still in telencephalon. Telencephalon, cerebrum is done. We are talking about the second part of the telencephalon, that's corpus striatum. Now students, if you look at your brain, the cerebrum was very much convoluted, compactly packed to accommodate a number of neurons in your brain. But it is not exactly when you look at the inner part of the cerebrum, medulla. So below the cortex, which is the outermost layer, below that cortex area, if I consider the room wall as the cerebral cortex, when you see inside, that inside is not so compactly packed. Instead, you have got several groups of neurons. So below the cerebrum cortex, the collection of neurons that you have got beta is called as subcortical. Subcortical means below the cortex. Subcortical nuclei or basal ganglia, that's the same thing. That's the group of neurons below your cortex, okay, below your cortex. What is the function of these neurons? We say that it controls the stereotypic activity. And what are these stereotypic activity? Is just like writing. Okay, the repeated actions are called as stereotypic actions, like writing, like cycling, like biting your nails. These all are some of the activities which are repeatedly done. So those repeated activities are with the help of the subcortical nuclei or basal ganglia. Also students, if I say that there are some big group of neurons among these, the largest collection of neurons, the biggest collection of neurons, the biggest group of neuron is called as corpus striatum. Getting my point? Corpus striatum is nothing but again nuclei only, collection of neurons only. The largest group of neuron is called as corpus striatum. Now you must be aware of some diseases like Parkinson's disease, like the Alzheimer's disease and so on. So what happens? There are certain group of neurons only. For example, the substantia nigra. I would give you one example. Substantia nigra. This substantia nigra beta is a collection of neuron that is present below the cortex only. Okay, that is also a collection of neuron. This substantia nigra produces dopamine. If you damage the dopamine producing substantia nigra, the person may suffer from Parkinson's disease. Got it? So different neurons are having different functions. Corpus striatum is nothing but the largest collection of neurons below your cortex area. Now talking about the next two parts of your cerebrum, of your telencephalon, that's your hippocampus and amygdala. These two parts are the last part of your telencephalon or forebrain. Now talking about hippocampus and amygdala, they together form a system called as limbic system. Along with the hippocampus and amygdala, some other parts are also there that forms the limbic system, but majorly it is formed by hippocampus and amygdala. The entire shape of limbic system is in the shape of fork. Fork shape structure it has, or we can say there is a bone in the birds that is called as wishbone. So it is also having the shape of wishbone or fork shape, the upper part of which is formed by the amygdala and the lower part of which is formed by hippocampus. Upper part by amygdala, above remember amygdala, okay, and the lower part is formed by hippocampus. Now looking at the something called as the emotional brain. Actually beta, your emotional brain is formed of this limbic system along with hypothalamus. The hypothalamus combining with the limbic system is forming your emotional brain that controls the various aspects of emotional human behavior that I am going to again describe in the hypothalamus, like sexual behavior, like the pleasure, like the happiness, like the fear, like the motivation. Any kind of human behavior is controlled by your emotional brain, which is formed by your hypothalamus along with the limbic system. Talking specifically about amygdala, it has got the shape of almond. Okay, that's given in NCERT. So remember the shape of amygdala, that's almond shaped structure. Now talking about their function, hippocampus is associated with memory and olfaction. What the hippocampus do is actually convert the short-term memory into long-term memory. That's the function of your hippocampus. Talking about amygdala, amygdala is specifically controlling the behavior like anger, gussana, the anger, and rage. Rage is that badla, okay, or what do you say, what is the other term of rage in English is revenge, okay. So revenge taking, rage or anger is controlled by the amygdala. Now talking about beta next part of your forebrain, that's your diencephalon, which has epithalamus, thalamus and hypothalamus. The very first part, if I talk about epithalamus, actually this is the non-nervous part. This is the non-nervous part of your brain, and this actually fuses with pia mater. When it fuses with the pia mater beta, it is going to form something called as anterior choroid plexus. It forms anterior choroid plexus, which is very important for secreting the cerebrospinal fluid. Once I will be discussing about the CSF and the ventricles of your brain, I will be telling you about this anterior choroid plexus. Here only you remember that epithalamus is a non-nervous part that fuses with the pia mater and forms the anterior choroid plexus. Talking about the part thalamus beta, cerebrum wraps over it. What I mean, if you look the diagram of NCERT, I have not made the diagram. If I say this is the thalamus, the entire cerebrum is wrapped over this part. So what we say that cerebrum wraps over a part which is called as thalamus. In NCERT they have made like this. This is the brain, this is the cerebrum, and here they have made the thalamus. So thalamus is completely wrapped over by the cerebrum. Also I have said that the cerebrum is present above the midbrain. It is located above the midbrain and it is controlling the conscious activity. The activities that you do consciously, that is controlled by the thalamus, but more than that, important function of the thalamus is that it is going to act as a relay center. Now what is a relay center? When we say relay center beta, in childhood we must have played relay race, and relay race means passing the information, not the information, passing the thing, okay. Not a single person is going to participate in that race. You have got several partners to help, right? Why is it called as a relay center? As I told you that cerebrum is wrapping over thalamus. If thalamus is here, cerebrum is here, all the information which has to pass to the cerebrum has to pass through thalamus. Since all the information before going to the cerebrum has to pass through thalamus, that's why it is also called as the relay center. Now we are going to talk about the function of the hypothalamus. Now talking about a very important part, that's hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, as the name is suggesting, would be definitely located below the thalamus, hence it is called as hypothalamus. Also, it is a connection between your nervous and endocrine part. Definitely beta, that's not only the part of your nervous system, it's also a part of your endocrine system, because it is acting as an endocrine gland also, and it has a control in your nervous system too. So it's a connection between your neural and your endocrine system. The functions of the hypothalamus includes that it is going to maintain your normal body temperature, it is going to control various aspects of human behavior, because as we have already discussed that this is going to form the emotional brain along with the limbic system. And when you talk about this human behavior, we have said that anger, fear, motivation, love, affection, pleasure, everything is controlled with the help of this emotional brain. Also, since it is the gland and you know that it has various hormones, so all the hormonal functions will be the function of the hypothalamus. For example, beta, I can say that your hypothalamus controls your thirst. How it controls your thirst? Because it has a hormone called as ADH or antidiuretic hormone that we have already mentioned in the excretion part. That this is the hormone of your hypothalamus but stored in the posterior pituitary, and whenever this is going to be released, it causes water reabsorption. So with the help of this hormone, it is going to regulate the amount of water in your body. Right? So with the help of these different hormones, can it help in the growth? Definitely it has got growth hormone releasing hormone. Can it help in the reproduction? It has got the hormones called as gonadotrophin releasing hormone acting upon the pituitary and cause the release of the gonadotrophins. So in a way, all the hormones of the hypothalamus will describe the function of overall hypothalamus itself. Got it? Now talking about midbrain, which has got no division. If you look at the dorsal part of the midbrain, it has got 4 swelling which are also called as 4 lobes. On the dorsal part, it has got 4 swellings, or it has got 4 lobes, which is called as corpora quadrigemina. Corpora, quadri means 4, quadrigemina. Now talking about the division of the corpora quadrigemina, these 2 swellings, 2 are located superiorly, 2 are located inferiorly, 2 called as the superior colliculi and 2 forms the inferior colliculi. These are the 4 swellings or the 4 lobes. Now, whenever we talk about beta reflex action, which is the quick involuntary action, suddenly something comes in our brain, that is in our mind, that's the spinal cord. That the reflex action is associated with the spinal cord. But do you know that some reflexes are controlled also by your brain? Not all the reflexes are your reflex action by your spinal cord. Not all the reflexes are your spinal reflexes. Some reflexes are also your cranial reflexes. You can see here I have written that the superior colliculi is related with the visual reflexes and your inferior colliculi is related with the auditory reflexes. What do you mean by this? Suddenly, if a bus goes in front of me, I will unconsciously, what I will do, I will just look at that bus moving, or somebody is moving in front of you. Unconsciously, my head and my eye movement is going to change. The coordinated movement of your eye along with your head, that is called as visual reflexes, that is controlled by the superior colliculi of your brain. How the of your midbrain. How the questions are framed, beta, that superior colliculi controls the auditory reflexes or your visual reflexes. So you have to remember that superior colliculi is always controlling your visual reflexes. I remember it in this way, that visual is also having S and superior also has S. So I remember it that way. You can remember it this way. Inferior colliculi is controlling the auditory reflexes, that is the coordinated movement of your ear along with the head. Somebody is calling from the back and we suddenly look. That's also a reflex action, and that's called as the auditory reflexes controlled by the inferior colliculi of your midbrain. Now here I have written one information, beta, which is going to be more clear while we discuss the ventricles of the brain. Okay, so this is iter or cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius that passes through the wall of midbrain. Now here you remember the information. Once I will be making the diagram of the ventricles, that will be, making you more clear about this location of the iter. For now, just remember that iter or cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius is passing through the midbrain. Now the last part of the brain that we are left with is the hindbrain, which has cerebellum, pons and medulla. Now cerebellum, beta, it has an appearance like this, right? And it has got a tree-like appearance. I will tell you why it has got tree-like appearance and what is the name used for the tree-like appearance. Now this is the little brain, okay? This is the little brain, and just like your cerebrum, it also has 2 hemispheres, 2 cerebellar hemispheres, okay? I have written that it has got 2 cerebellar hemisphere and it also has outside grey matter and inside white matter. Now there are several collection of neurons that connects the cerebellum with the different regions of your brain, like with the midbrain, with the pons, with the medulla. The neurons that passes from the cerebellum and connects the different parts of the brain is called as peduncle. Okay, and I will tell you what is the name of the one which connects with the midbrain, with the pons and with the medulla. Before that, I have mentioned something called as arbor vitae. Beta, the arrangement of the grey matter and white matter in the cerebellum is giving a tree-like appearance, which is why it is called as arbor vitae. So related with the arrangement of grey matter and white matter in the cerebellum. Now talking about the peduncles that connects with the midbrain, with the pons and medulla, what is the name? The one which connects with the midbrain is called as superior peduncle. The one which connects with the pons is called as the middle peduncle. And the one which connects with the medulla is called as the inferior peduncle. The superior peduncle, the middle peduncle and the inferior peduncle. These are the three peduncles, which is the collection of neurons connecting the different parts with the cerebellum. Now talking about the next part of your hindbrain is the medulla. Medulla, I have written, is the posterior most part. That is the posterior most part of your hindbrain or your brain, you will say. And this medulla is the part actually that continues with the spinal cord. And this medulla has posterior choroid plexus. I have already mentioned about the anterior choroid plexus, beta. Anterior choroid plexus we have already discussed in the epithalamus part, and it has also called posterior choroid plexus. Now since we are already discussing, taking so many times the name of plexus, wherever you use this term is actually the network. Here it is the network of blood capillaries or blood vessels, or it can be even network of nerves. For network you use the term plexus, but the term that I am using is the anterior choroid plexus, and posterior choroid plexus is actually the network of blood capillaries. Okay, you will see that these choroid plexus are actually responsible for secreting the CSF. Now talking about what is the function of medulla, beta, it has several centers like respiratory reflex center, then it has got cardiovascular centers. That means it can be able to control the respiratory reflexes and it can control the cardiovascular reflexes. If you remember in breathing chapter, we discussed about the respiratory rhythm center that controls the major part of the normal breathing, normal inhalation, normal exhalation, forceful inhalation, forceful exhalation. That's the property, that's the control with the help of RRC present in the medulla. Talking about the cardiovascular reflexes, you have got cardio-acceleratory center, cardio-inhibitory center, both located in the medullary region that can control the cardiovascular reflexes, increasing the rate of heartbeat as well as decreasing the rate of heartbeat. Now talking about the last part of your brain as well as the last part of your hindbrain is the pons. Whenever we say pons beta is actually literally meaning the bridge. And bridge is something which connects. Although pons is going to connect the different parts of the brain, but majorly pons is going to connect the cerebrum with the cerebellum. The cerebrum and the cerebellum are connected with the network of neurons of the pons. So that's how it is acting as a bridge. Also beta, we know that pons can control the respiration and it has got center called as pneumotaxic center, and we know that pneumotaxic center was working along with the respiratory rhythm center. So that's about the different parts of the brain. Although in NCERT there is just one paragraph given, but that one paragraph becomes quite important even if we have done so much. Okay, so go through that part as well. But there is some part still remaining about the brain beta, that's about the ventricles. Now what is this ventricle? Usually whenever a person hears about the ventricle, you only think about your heart. Heart has got cavity which is called as the ventricles of the heart, which has blood. In the same way beta, your brain also has got cavities which is called as the ventricles of the brain. If I do the sagittal section, what is a sagittal section? It's a kind of longitudinal section that is going to keep your ventral and dorsal side together. If I do this kind of a section, that is also a longitudinal section. If I do this kind of a section, this is also a longitudinal section. In NCERT, they have given you the sagittal section of the brain, this kind of a section. If I do this section, these two parts are separated, but each part is having ventral and dorsal part. Okay. Anyway, if I want to look for the ventricles beta, let us look at the cavities that is present in your brain, and those cavities are called as which ventricles, and we will be seeing that which part of the brain is actually covering which ventricle? Now let us see. I have made a rough diagram which will help you in understanding the different spaces in your brain called as the ventricles. Talking about what are the ventricles, beta, you have got lateral ventricles. These two present on the lateral side are called as the lateral ventricles. Then you have this space is called as the third ventricle. Do you know why we didn't say second ventricle? Is because you already had two lateral ventricles. So 1 and 2 for two lateral ventricles, then you have third ventricle, then you have fourth ventricle. Now talking about the wall of each ventricle, beta, the lateral ventricles, these two are the lateral ventricles. The wall of the lateral ventricle is actually the cerebrum. Cerebrum forms the wall of your lateral ventricles, whereas the wall of the third ventricle you will see is formed by the diencephalon. Okay? And the wall of the fourth ventricle, this is the fourth ventricle, the wall of the fourth ventricle is formed by pons. Here you will have cerebellum. Am I clear with this? The wall of the lateral ventricles are formed by cerebrum. Then the lateral ventricles are connected with the third ventricle. The wall of the third ventricle is formed by diencephalon. Then the third ventricle is connected with the fourth ventricle, and the wall of the fourth ventricle is formed by pons. Clear? Now all these ventricles, beta, is going to have the CSF. But before we understand how the CSF is secreted, what is the composition and what is the function, let us first understand some more things about this diagram. If I want to ask you, beta, the lateral ventricles are connected with the third ventricle with the help of which opening? If I say your lateral ventricles are connected with this ventricle with the help of an opening present over here, that opening is called as foramen of Monro. So remember that foramen of Monro is the opening that connects your lateral ventricles with the third ventricle. Clear? But your third ventricle is also connected with the fourth ventricle. Yes or no? The lateral ventricles connected with the third ventricle with the foramen of Monro, and your third ventricle connected with the fourth ventricle. Do you see this duct? This duct is connecting your third ventricle with the fourth ventricle, and this duct, beta, is called as iter, which I already discussed in the midbrain. Iter or cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius, and now you know very well that the iter or the duct of Sylvius or the aqueduct is surrounded by the midbrain wall. I hope you are clear with everything. Lateral ventricle by the cerebrum, the third ventricle with the diencephalon, the iter with the midbrain, and the fourth ventricle with the pons. Also, foramen of Monro was connecting your lateral ventricles with the third ventricle. But when you see the fourth ventricle, beta, fourth ventricle has got some openings. Now in your lateral ventricle also you have CSF, in your third ventricle also you have CSF, in your fourth ventricle also you have CSF. But do you remember a space which also had CSF? That is your subarachnoid space. Where is that subarachnoid space receiving that CSF from? Actually, the CSF is passing from the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space with the help of the openings. Now, talking about these openings, you have two lateral openings in your fourth ventricle and one medial opening. The two lateral openings are called as foramen of Luschka. That's foramen of Luschka, and a single opening is called as foramen of Monro, which is present medially. The medial opening is not the Monro. I'm so sorry. It's not Monro. It's Magendie. It's called as Magendie. Monro is actually the connection between the lateral ventricles with the third ventricle. The connection between the third ventricle and the lateral ventricles are with the help of foramen of Monro. The medial opening is called as foramen of Magendie, beta. Don't get confused between Monro and Magendie. See, I have also written some, by mistake. Don't confuse it. Foramen of Magendie is the medial opening on the fourth ventricle. The lateral opening are called as foramen of Luschka. Through these opening, the CSF is passing through your subarachnoid space. But how this CSF is coming in your ventricles? How this CSF is being secreted? I have written that CSF, which is the cerebrospinal fluid, beta, this is actually secreted by the anterior and posterior choroid plexus. And what is this anterior and posterior choroid plexus, it is the network of blood capillaries. And with the help of these network of blood capillaries, you are secreting the CSF, which has large amount of water, it has got glucose, it has got amino acid, it has got several ions, and the CSF is going to act as a shock absorber in your brain. It is going to absorb the shock, all the things that passes from your blood to your brain tissue is mediated by the CSF, okay, acting as a shock absorber, acting as a medium for the transfer, is having high amount of glucose that is going to provide nourishment to the brain tissue. So very important function of CSF. And beta, remember, this is not only present in the ventricles of your brain. It is not only present in the ventricles of your brain. In fact, your cerebrospinal fluid is also present in the spinal cord. Got my point? So this is what we discussed today in the very important part of your central nervous system, that was brain. Remember beta, whatever I am teaching you, definitely it's a little bit more than what is given in NCERT, I understand. But always remember that whether you study, whatever content you study will not matter if you are not able to pay attention to NCERT. So that's why at the end of every class I tell you that please go through NCERT, please read everything that's given in NCERT. Alright, so that's how we end today's class. We are done with the one part of your brain, one part of your central nervous system, that's the brain. But in the next class, we are going to start with the spinal cord. And very important things related with the spinal cord is the different the parts. Very first thing is the part of the spinal cord. Then we will be discussing about a very important phenomena, which is reflex action. All right. So I am leaving your class. Make sure that you read everything, study well, prepare for your examinations beta. Till then, we are going to come back soon with the reflex action very soon. Take care. Tata. Bye bye.